Sometimes we'll say yes. But nevertheless, God always answers prayer. Amen. This text today, Matthew chapter 7, is a part of a larger teaching called the Sermon on the Mount. This Sermon on the Mount is where Jesus is teaching the righteous standards for kingdom living. He begins in chapter 5 by pronouncing blessings upon those who are obedient to the word of God. Blessed is he that endures. Blessed is he that has mercy. Blessed. And he pronounces blessings upon all of those who are trying to live for God. But yet and still, even though Jesus is pronouncing blessings in this particular passage, he is not teaching us to depend upon ourselves. Jesus says that when you are totally dependent upon God, that is when you are lining yourself up to receive the blessings of God. Are y'all going to walk with me today? He says that in order for us to receive God's blessings, we must first be dependent on God. He stresses that the only way you can become qualified to be a citizen in heaven is to acknowledge your own unworthiness. In other words, God says you line yourself up for the greatest blessing when you realize that you are not worthy of anything from the Lord. And I want to remind somebody today that everything you have, everything that you have ever received, you did not get it because you were worthy. That God has blessed you despite your unworthiness. Paul says in Romans 5:8 that while we were yet sinners, that Christ died for us. Everything that you have not deserved it. And the truth of the matter is, we don't deserve anything from God. And Jesus says that everything you have, you must realize that you are unworthy to receive it. In other words, in Matthew 5 through 7, Jesus teaches that we need help. Jesus says it is when you realize that you need help that you can get the access from God that you really need.
Remember how to turn it to.
Y'all gonna let me preach this to you?
Put it on.
He says you must realize, number one, that you are unworthy. And then in Matthew chapter 7, Jesus answers the question. How do we receive from God what we really need? This is the second section of this teaching in which Jesus addresses the subject of prayer. You remember earlier in Matthew chapter 6, the disciples asked the question, Lord, teach us to pray. And when Jesus taught them to pray, he said, when you pray, pray like this. Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. And then Jesus says that when you go to God, you go to God like this. But then in chapter 7, he teaches us why we ought to pray. In chapter 6, he teaches us how to pray. But in chapter 7, he explains why. In this text, Jesus gives us two reasons. Memorize on why we should pray. The two reasons we ought to pray is, number one, that prayer is commanded by God. Y'all get that? It's commanded by God. And then number two, not only is it commanded by God, but prayer gives us confidence in the goodness of God.
I just put it in.
Y'all gonna follow me here? Prayer is commanded by God, and then gives us confidence in the goodness of God. Look what Jesus says in verse 7. He says, ask, and it will be given unto you. Seek, and ye will find. Knock, and it will be open unto you. Jesus says that when you pray, you can find confidence in the goodness of God. In verse 7, we find two things. We find a call to believing prayer, and then we find a promise of answered prayer. You see? Look what he says.
There's no magic.
Ask when you have a need. Seek when you have a desire.
One of church.
Knock when you have a wish.
Huh?
This text is symbolic of the three different kinds of people in the world today. He says, to the child of God, you can ask. To the lost person who does not know God, you can seek salvation. He says to the person that's gone astray, knock on the door, and it shall be opened. And ultimately, this text teaches us not only about the one who prays,